The neighborhood looked calm from the outside, the kind of place where mornings felt slow and safe. Birds sat on the fences, kids rode their bikes in the distance, and most people waved to anyone passing by. When the new homeowner arrived with a small moving truck and a car filled with boxes, he felt hopeful. He had worked hard for many years to afford a place like this. For him, this neighborhood was not just a home, but the start of a new chapter. He moved quietly, stacking boxes in the living room and dragging furniture across the hallway. Several neighbors watched from their porches, some smiling, others just curious. A few came by to welcome him, offering short greetings or asking where he came from. Everyone told him the same thing: it's a peaceful place. People follow rules, and everything stays in order. He nodded, thinking it was normal. Every neighborhood had rules. That evening, he sat in his new kitchen, drinking a cup of tea and listening to the soft hum of the fridge. The house felt empty, but good. He was finally on his own, and he planned to make this place comfortable. He walked from room to room, planning small changes he wanted to make. A fresh coat of paint in the bedroom, a couple of plants on the porch, maybe new lights in the hallway. Nothing big, just small touches to make the house feel like home. The next morning, he stepped outside to take a walk and get used to the area. The streets were clean. The sidewalks were lined with trees trimmed to the same height. Lawns looked almost too perfect. He noticed it, but didn't think much of it. He assumed people here simply liked things neat. When he returned home, he found a small white envelope taped to his door. He pulled it off, thinking it might be a welcome letter. But instead, it was something else. A notice. He read it twice. Minor violation was written at the top in bold letters. The issue was simple: a small box he had left near the curb while moving in. He blinked at the paper, confused. The box had been there for only a couple of hours. He hadn't even finished unpacking. He shrugged it off. Maybe the neighborhood had strict rules about trash or clutter. He moved the box inside and tossed the notice into a drawer. He wasn't upset. He thought it was just part of living in a well-managed community. In the first week, nothing unusual happened. He settled in slowly. He bought a few plants, fixed a loose cabinet door, and placed a chair on the porch so he could sit outside in the evenings. His neighbors seemed friendly enough, though he noticed most of them kept to themselves. Everyone seemed careful, almost overly aware of how their houses looked. But he didn't pay much attention. One afternoon, he sat on his porch, taking in the quiet surroundings. The sky had a warm glow as the sun dipped low, and the soft breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut grass. Across the street, an older man worked on his garden. A young couple walked by, their dog pulling on the leash. Nothing felt strange or alarming. He thought he had made the right choice by moving here. But the calm did not last long. A few days later, he found another envelope taped to his door. It looked like the first one, neat and official. He sighed before opening it. Another notice. This time, it said his grass was a little too long. He stared at the lawn. It looked fine to him. Not too short, not too long. He had planned to cut it on the weekend anyway. But apparently, the Homeowners Association, the HOA, did not think waiting a couple of days was acceptable. He mowed the lawn that evening as the sky turned orange. He didn't want trouble. He wanted to be the kind of neighbor who followed the rules. After finishing, he looked around and saw another person mowing their lawn too. Their grass looked longer than his had been, but he didn't see any notice on their door. He brushed the thought away. Maybe he was overthinking. For the next week, he made sure to keep everything tidy. He double-checked the mailbox for more notices. He trimmed the bushes, swept the porch, and even cleaned the driveway. He did not want any more issues, but another envelope still showed up. This one claimed his porch light was too bright. He frowned. It was the same bulb already installed when he moved in. He hadn't even touched it. Still, he changed the bulb to a softer one and hoped that would end things. He tried not to worry about it. But the repeated notices felt unnecessary. It was as if someone was watching his house closely, waiting for the smallest thing to point out. Later that day, while taking out the trash, he saw one of his neighbors watering plants. She gave him a small smile. He walked over politely and asked if all these notices were normal. She hesitated before answering. "Well, the HOA here is strict," she said gently. "Some people get notices more than others. You're new, so maybe they're keeping an eye on you." He didn't understand why being new meant being watched more. But he thanked her and walked back inside, feeling uneasy for the first time since moving in. Another week passed, and the pattern continued. Every time he thought he had fixed one thing, another notice would appear. The reasons became more confusing. A slightly uneven curtain, a misaligned welcome mat, even a possible paint fade, something he couldn't even see. He started waking up early, just to check if a new notice had been left overnight. He began to feel like he couldn't relax. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes on him, though he couldn't say whose. People still greeted him politely, but something felt off. The smiles seemed a little too quick, the glances a little too sharp. One morning, he heard two neighbors talking as he walked toward his mailbox. He heard his house mentioned softly, followed by a sigh and a comment he couldn't fully catch. When they saw him, they immediately changed the topic. He forced a small smile and nodded, but inside, he felt a knot tighten. Despite all this, he kept telling himself that things would get better. Maybe the HOA just wanted him to adjust to the rules. Maybe after a few weeks, they would stop sending notices. But deep down, he sensed something was wrong. Late one night, he sat in his living room, with the lights low. He had placed all the notices in a pile on the table. He flipped through them slowly, one by one. Some were reasonable. Others made no sense at all. The stack was growing too fast for someone who only wanted to live quietly. He wondered if he should talk to someone from the HOA. Maybe they would explain things. Maybe they would understand that he was trying his best. But a small voice inside him whispered that talking might not change anything. As he lay in bed that night, he stared at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of his new home. The house felt safe, but the neighborhood did not feel like it did in the beginning. Something invisible hung in the air: rules, expectations, pressure. He didn't know how far things would go. He didn't know how many more notices he would receive. He didn't know why he had been singled out. He only knew one thing. This was no longer the peaceful place he thought it was, and the people pushing these rules had no idea what they were starting. The next few days moved slowly, and the new homeowner tried to keep himself busy, hoping the strange pattern of notices would eventually end. He fixed anything that could be fixed, cleaned every corner of his yard, and kept his house looking as perfect as he could manage. He didn't want any more trouble. He didn't want to stand out. He only wanted to live peacefully. But the peace he wished for stayed just out of reach. One morning, he stepped outside with a cup of tea in hand. The air was cool, and the street was quiet. He looked at the houses lined up neatly across the road. Their lawns were trimmed exactly the same way, the colors on their walls untouched, and the windows spotless. It felt strange to him now, too perfect. It's almost like someone had placed everything there intentionally. He walked down the small path toward the mailbox. As he reached it, he saw something sitting on top, a familiar white envelope. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a slow breath, and picked it up. When he opened it, he felt the same dull ache in his chest, the same frustration creeping up. Another notice? This one said his driveway had a light stain. He looked down at it. There was nothing more than a faint mark, something that could easily happen from rain or dust blowing around. It was barely visible. Anyone else might not have noticed it at all. He rubbed his forehead. It was just one more thing out of a long list, and he knew if he complained, he would still be the one seen as causing trouble. So he pulled out a brush and scrubbed the driveway until his arms ached and the stain faded. While he worked, a neighbor across the street came out to check his mail. The homeowner waved politely, but the neighbor only gave a short nod before hurrying back inside. It felt cold. Different from the warm greetings he had received when he first arrived, the difference bothered him. The next morning, another letter appeared. He didn't even have to open it to know what it was. He could almost feel the disappointment before he read the words. This time, the notice said his trash bins were slightly misaligned. He stared at the bins. They were straight, standing next to each other, not even a few inches apart. He adjusted them anyway, pushing them left and right until they matched perfectly as he turned around. He noticed a woman standing on her porch across the street, watching him quietly. When he met her eyes, she quickly looked away and went back inside. He wasn't sure if she had been observing him or just happened to be outside, but he could not shake off the feeling that someone, or maybe several people, were keeping a close eye on his home. That evening, he sat on the couch with a notebook in his hand. He wrote down each notice he had received and the dates they arrived. The list was growing longer by the day. He traced the lines with his thumb and bit the inside of his cheek. He wondered if he should call the HOA office again. But the first time he tried, they hardly listened. The person on the phone spoke quickly and sounded impatient, repeating the rules as if he had memorized them by heart. He didn't want another conversation like that, so he kept his head down, hoping things would eventually settle. A few days later, he was watering the plants on his porch when he heard footsteps. He looked toward the sidewalk and saw a man from the HOA approaching. The man was dressed neatly, holding a clipboard against his chest. "Good afternoon," the man said with a brief smile. The homeowner returned the greeting. Though he felt uneasy, "I just wanted to stop by and remind you about the community standards," the HOA member continued. "We've noticed a few things around your property that need attention." The homeowner nodded slowly. "I've been trying my best to follow everything. If there's something wrong, you can tell me directly." The man hesitated for a second, glanced at his clipboard and said, "Well, the porch railing has a tiny mark, and your mailbox is slightly tilted. We prefer everything to stay uniform here." He nodded again, though the words stung. "I'll fix it." The HOA member gave a polite smile before walking away. The homeowner stood there for a long moment, staring at the porch railing. There was hardly anything wrong with it. Just a small scratch from when he had moved furniture inside, something any normal person would ignore, but not here. Later that night, as he tried to sleep, he heard soft murmurs outside. He got up quietly and walked to the living room window, peeking through the blinds. Two people stood under a streetlight, talking in hushed voices. One pointed toward his house. His heart thumped. He moved back, unable to hear what they were saying, but feeling the heaviness of the moment. He wondered if he was imagining it, if maybe they were just neighbors talking about something unrelated. But the way they kept looking at his house made him doubt it. The next day he decided to take a short walk to clear his mind. As he walked past houses he had seen many times before, he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to earlier. Some homes had little imperfections, chips in the paint, uneven grass patches, faded signs, things he had been fined for, but they didn't have any notices taped to their doors. That realization hit him harder than any letter had. It wasn't just about rules. It wasn't just about order. Someone, or maybe the entire group, was choosing to be harder on him than on anyone else. As he stood in front of a house with cracked paint, he thought about speaking to the neighbors again. But every time he tried to approach someone, they gave short answers or acted like they had somewhere to be. The friendliness he experienced when he first moved in had slowly faded. One evening, while he watered his plants, a neighbor walking by paused for a moment. The homeowner greeted him with a smile. The man hesitated before responding. "You're getting a lot of notices," he said softly. The homeowner nodded. "Yes, I'm trying to figure out why." The man lowered his voice. "The HOA here focuses too much on small things. Some people don't say anything because they don't want trouble. Nobody wants to be on their bad side." The homeowner asked. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked around nervously. "Just be careful. They're very strict. And once they start watching someone, they keep going." Before the homeowner could ask more, the man walked away quickly. The words stayed with him all night. Once they start watching someone, they keep going. The next morning, he received yet another notice. This one made him pause longer than usual. It said he had placed furniture too close to the porch edge. He looked at the chair. It was no more than a foot from where it had always been. Nothing dangerous, nothing out of place. Just a normal porch chair. He picked it up and moved it anyway, but a heavy feeling settled inside him. It felt less like rule enforcement and more like pressure, like someone was slowly tightening something around him that evening. He saw two people from the HOA walking down the street. They stopped in front of his house, pointed at something, wrote on their clipboards, then moved on. He stood behind his blinds again. Watching quietly, it felt intrusive. He finally realized something important. No matter how perfect he tried to be, the notices would not stop. They always found something new, something small, something unnecessary. The quiet frustration inside him grew into something deeper. It wasn't anger, not yet, but it was a slow, steady awareness. This was not normal. This was not about keeping the neighborhood clean. This was something else. As days passed, the weight of the situation pressed harder on him. He woke up earlier, worked longer, cleaned more often, and still felt like he was being watched and judged. He wondered how far the HOA would go. He wondered how long he could stay patient. He looked at the pile of notices again, now too thick to ignore. He had tried to understand. He had tried to adjust. He had tried to follow every rule, but they kept pushing, and without knowing it, they were pushing him closer to a moment that would change everything. A moment where he would no longer stay silent. A moment they never expected. The next few days passed with a strange heaviness that felt new to him. He tried to go about his days the same way he always did quiet mornings. Small chores, a cup of tea in the evening, but something inside him was changing. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was more like a slow tightening, as if pressure was building quietly, one layer at a time. The repeated knocks on his piece had finally begun to leave a mark, even though he tried to act normal. The tension in the air kept reminding him that things were not normal anymore. The notices had become a part of his daily life. Sometimes he found one in the morning, sometimes at noon, sometimes late in the evening when he least expected it. And each time he opened the door, a part of him hesitated, worried about what he might find. He had never imagined a simple move to a quiet neighborhood would turn into something like this. One evening, he stepped outside to check his porch light out of habit. The sun had already set, leaving a pale blue color across the sky. The trees on both sides of the street cast long shadows on the pavement, and the sound of crickets filled the air as he stood there. Looking around, he noticed a faint noise coming from the street. He looked down the road and saw a small group of people walking together. They stopped near one house, whispered something, then moved to another. Their movements were slow and deliberate. When they reached his house, they didn't come up the driveway. Instead, they paused for a moment, pointed at his porch, tapped something on their phones, and walked away. A chill ran down his back. He felt tired of guessing, tired of fixing little things, tired of feeling like someone always had a problem with him. He leaned against the porch wall and took a deep breath. Trying to decide what to do next, he knew he couldn't continue living like this. The breaking point came a few days later. It was early morning, and he stepped outside with his keys in hand, planning to run a few errands. But the moment he opened his door, he saw a bright red notice taped right in the center. Not white like the others. Not subtle. Not small. He pulled it off the door and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page slowly. As he read, he felt his hands tighten around the paper. This notice accused him of a major violation. Not minor, major the reason? Property disruption. Something about how his yard was affecting the overall look of the neighborhood. It didn't even explain what the disruption was. It just said he had to pay a heavy fine within a few days. His heart sank. He knew this wasn't fair. He had kept everything neat, even more than needed. He had followed every rule they threw at him. Yet somehow they had found a way to escalate things again. He walked to the sidewalk and stared at his yard. It looked perfectly fine as anyone else's. Better even. The grass was trimmed, the plants were healthy, the porch was clean. Nothing was wrong, and yet they had given him a major violation. He felt something shift inside him. Something calm but strong. This wasn't about a yard. This wasn't about a porch light or a chair. This was about control. About someone trying to push him until he gave. Upper left. But he wasn't going to leave. He took the notice inside and placed it on the table. For the first time since moving in, he didn't try to fix anything right away. He didn't rush outside to check for a problem. He didn't blame himself. He just sat there quietly, thinking. After a few minutes, he got up and opened the drawer where he had placed all the previous notices. The stack had become thick, too thick, for someone living a normal life. He spread them out on the table, one by one. Every notice, every date, every small complaint. Seeing them all at once made things clearer. These weren't just rules being enforced. This was a pattern, a targeted pattern. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but his instincts told him this wasn't random. Someone wanted him to feel trapped as he sat there. A knock suddenly echoed through the house. He froze for a moment, then slowly walked to the door. When he opened it, he saw a woman from the neighborhood standing there, holding a small notebook. She gave him a polite but tense smile. "Good morning," she said softly. He nodded. "Morning. Can I help you?" She hesitated before speaking. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA. We received a report about some issues with your property. I was asked to check and take notes." He felt a small spark of frustration, but kept his voice calm. "What issues?" She glanced around nervously before answering. "I'm not sure. I was just told to check everything. The board said your home was becoming a concern." A concern, the word felt heavy. She walked around the yard writing small notes in her notebook. He watched quietly, noticing how long she took at every corner, how she paused at things that were normal. After a few minutes, she turned back to him with an uncomfortable expression. "I'll have to file a report," she said quietly. "For what?" he asked. She looked down, avoiding his eyes. "I'm not really allowed to say. The board handles the decisions." He pressed his lips together. "But you don't see anything wrong here, do you?" She hesitated again. The brief silence said everything. At last she whispered, "Just be careful. That's all I can say." And then she left. Her warning echoed in his mind long after she was gone. He closed the door and leaned against it. He didn't want to live in fear or frustration. He didn't want to argue or fight. But he also couldn't keep living under these conditions. Throughout the day, he kept thinking about what she had said. He tried to distract himself by working on a few things inside the house. But every time he glanced at the pile of notices, he felt the pressure return. He sat down that evening with a blank notebook and began writing. Not complaints, not angry words. Just facts, times, notices, interactions, everything he remembered. It was the first time he kept proper records. Part of him wasn't sure why he was doing it, but another part knew exactly why he had reached his limit later that night. While he was locking the front door, he heard a quiet sound outside. He turned his head and looked through the window. A car moved slowly down the street with its headlights dimmed. The driver glanced at his house more than once. He stepped back into the shadows and watched the car creep past. It didn't stop. But the way the driver scanned his property felt unsettling. He didn't know if it was someone from the HOA or just a neighbor. But either way, the message felt the same. The next morning, when he stepped outside, he found yet another notice. This one wasn't on his door. It was placed directly on the porch floor, almost as if someone wanted to make sure he didn't miss it. It said his mailbox color didn't match the shade recommended by the board. He stared at it blankly. It was the same mailbox that came with the house. The same one everyone else had. That was the moment something finally snapped inside him, not in anger, but in clarity. He realized the HOA wasn't going to stop. He wasn't just dealing with strict rules. He was dealing with people who thought they could control him completely. People who assumed he would stay quiet forever. He wasn't going to allow that anymore. He sat at his dining table again, looking at the long line of notices. His hands were steady now. His thoughts were clearer. He knew he couldn't fight back by yelling or complaining. That would only give them more reasons to target him. He needed to think differently. He needed to learn the rules better than they did. That evening, he drove to the local library. He spent hours reading about HOAs, how they operated, what they legally could and couldn't do, what rights homeowners had, and what rights HOA boards often pretended to have. He took notes, wrote down laws, and bookmarked pages. For the first time since moving in, he felt a sense of control returning to him. It wasn't much. It was enough to keep him going. He realized the HOA controlled people because they expected no one would push back. They relied on fear and silence. But he was done being silent. When he returned home that night, the street looked the same as always, quiet, in order, untouched by the things he was feeling inside. But everything had changed. He locked the door behind him and looked around his home. It felt different now. Not just a place he lived in, but a place worth protecting. He picked up his notebook again, added the library notes to it, and placed it carefully on the table. It wasn't a full plan yet, but it was the beginning of one, and without realizing it, the HOA had pushed him exactly where they didn't want him to go. They had pushed too far soon. He would push back. In the days that followed, he felt an odd calm settle inside him, as if everything he had gone through up to this point had prepared him for what was coming next. The final warning from the HOA wasn't just another piece of paper. It was a clear signal that they were no longer trying to hide what they were doing. They wanted to push him into a corner. But instead of stepping back, he used that pressure as fuel. He woke up early the next morning, long before the sun painted the sky, and sat at his kitchen table with a cup of warm tea. The quiet of the house gave him space to think clearly. He spread out all the documents he had collected, laying them across the table like pieces of a puzzle. Every warning, every picture, every date. He reviewed everything one more time. As he went through each page, he started to notice patterns. The timing of the warnings lined up almost too perfectly, as if someone was watching closely and picking moments when they thought he wouldn't fight back. Some letters had similar wording, almost copied from each other, even when the issues were different. The visits from the board members always happened early in the morning or late in the afternoon. Times when they assumed he would be too tired to ask questions. It became clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was targeted, but now he wasn't alone. That thought gave him strength. Later that afternoon, he met with a small group of neighbors again. More people had joined this time, some of them hearing about what he was doing through word of mouth. They came quietly, looking around as they approached his house, worried someone might see them. The weight of the HOA's influence had made everyone feel like they had to hide simply to talk. He welcomed them inside and spoke gently, making sure no one felt pressured. He carefully shared what he had learned from the expert, explaining their rights in simple terms. Every time he spoke, he watched their faces shift from fear to realization, to something that resembled hope. One older couple admitted they had been dealing with unfair fines for months, but had paid them because they didn't want any trouble. A single mother shared how she had been warned about her child's bicycle being left on the porch for just a few minutes. Another neighbor said the HOA had denied his request to repaint his own front door, even though others on the same street had the exact same color. Hearing these stories made the room feel heavier, but it also united them. The more they talked, the clearer it became that the HOA had been using fear as a tool. But fear can only hold power when people stay silent. After the meeting ended, he walked a few neighbors to their cars, reassuring them quietly. Even though it seemed like a small step, he knew how important it was. Standing together was their greatest strength now. Once he was back inside, he turned on his laptop and started drafting something he knew would change everything. A formal complaint supported by multiple residents. He wasn't rushing. Every word mattered. He wanted the complaint to be clear, respectful, and detailed. He included dates, photocopies of notices, testimonies from neighbors, and references to the HOA's own bylaws. By the time he finished, hours had passed. But the document in front of him felt solid, like a foundation built to last. He printed copies and placed them in a folder. Then he sat back and breathed out slowly. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he felt more prepared than ever. The next morning, something unexpected happened. He stepped outside and saw an HOA board member waiting at the edge of his driveway. The man stood stiffly, holding another envelope in his hand. His expression was unreadable. The man greeted him with a tight smile and said he had come to clarify the final warning. But as he listened, it was clear they weren't clarifying anything. They were trying to intimidate him. They spoke in vague terms, saying things like, "We hope you cooperate," and "It's important that all residents stay in line." For a moment he felt the same frustration that had been eating at him for weeks. But then he remembered the support he had behind him now. He remembered the neighbors who trusted him. So instead of reacting with anger, he remained calm. He simply told the board member that he understood the situation clearly and that he would be responding soon. The board member didn't like that answer. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and tried to speak again. But the firmness in the homeowner's eyes stopped him. Eventually, the man turned around and walked away without another word. That interaction confirmed something important. The HOA was nervous. They sensed the shift, even if they didn't know the full extent of it yet. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses and the street fell quiet, he walked door to door, delivering copies of the complaint for neighbors who wanted to sign. Many of them opened their doors with hopeful smiles, grateful to finally have a chance to stand up for themselves. He didn't rush them. Some were ready to sign immediately. Others took their time reading through the document, asking questions that he answered patiently. The neighborhood felt different now, more connected, more awake. By the end of the night, the folder he carried was filled with signatures, more than he expected. He went back home, feeling a mixture of relief and purpose. He placed the signed documents on the table, sat down, and spent a few minutes in silence. Everything he had gone through, the warnings, the accusations, the stressful of it, had led him to this moment. The next day, he submitted the complaint to the proper authorities. Not to the HOA, but to the organization responsible for overseeing community associations in the area. It was the step the HOA didn't expect, the one they never imagined a resident would take. After everything was submitted, there was nothing to do but wait. Weeks passed slowly. The HOA continued sending small notices, but their tone seemed unsure now, almost hesitant. They didn't know what was coming, and that uncertainty made them less bold. Meanwhile, the neighbors who had joined his efforts grew closer. They met quietly in garages, living rooms, and backyards, sharing updates and supporting one another. Some even began helping elderly residents understand their rights. It didn't feel like a neighborhood living under fear anymore. It felt like a community learning to stand together. Then, one afternoon, he received a letter not from the HOA, but from the review board that handled complaints. When he opened it, his heart raced. They had accepted his complaint. More importantly, they were launching a formal investigation. He sat down slowly and read the letter again, making sure he understood every word. The board would be reviewing all documents submitted, examining the HOA's history, and interviewing residents. This was the outcome he had hoped for, the step that could change everything. But he also knew this wasn't the end. There was still a whole process ahead. The HOA would try to defend itself, maybe even deny everything. They might try to shift blame or claim misunderstandings. Yet none of that scared him anymore. He closed the letter, placed it safely inside his folder, and then stepped outside. The air felt lighter. The street looked brighter. The neighborhood, once weighed down by silent fear, now carried a quiet strength. He knew the next part of the journey would be challenging, but he also knew something else, something the HOA had never expected. He wasn't fighting alone anymore, and that changed everything. As he stood on his porch, looking out at the homes lined neatly along the street, he felt a sense of hope that had been missing for a long time. He wasn't just responding to the HOA anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had been pushed too far, and now, with the investigation officially underway, he knew the real turning point was just beginning. The investigation brought a new kind of silence to the neighborhood. It wasn't the same heavy silence that had hung in the air before, the kind filled with fear and tension. This silence felt different. It carried a sense of waiting, a feeling that something big was finally moving beneath the surface. For weeks, people noticed small changes. Cars from the review board would drive slowly through the streets, stopping occasionally to take notes or speak to residents. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now walked up to him with gentle smiles, telling him they had spoken honestly with the investigators. Some even shared that the investigators seemed surprised by how many similar stories they heard. He tried not to get his hopes too high, but every time someone mentioned another resident coming forward, he felt a quiet victory inside. The HOA, however, acted differently. Members who once walked around with stiff confidence now avoided being seen. Instead of patrolling the neighborhood, they stayed inside their cars or sent emails instead of showing up in person. The bold tone in their notices faded too, almost as if they were trying to behave better while someone was watching. One day, the president of the HOA sent an email to all residents, saying they were fully cooperating with the investigation and encouraging the community to remain patient. But the wording sounded like something written out of pressure, not sincerity. The neighbors could feel it too. As time passed, he continued documenting everything, even during the investigation. He wanted to be prepared for any outcome. Some nights he stayed up late, reviewing papers or talking with neighbors who needed reassurance. He didn't want anyone to feel alone through the process then. One morning, something happened that no one expected. A representative from the review board visited his home personally. The representative was calm, polite, and professional. They thanked him for his detailed complaint and for the effort he had taken to bring multiple residents together. They said that the investigation was reaching its final stage and that all the information he had provided had been extremely helpful. Hearing that made him feel a mix of relief and nervousness. The journey had been long, and part of him wondered what the final decision would be. A week later, the entire neighborhood received a notice. Not from the HOA, but from the review board. It stated that the reinvestigation was complete. They had found multiple issues with the HOA's behavior. The review board concluded that the HOA had violated several regulations, including unclear rule enforcement, inconsistent penalties, and actions that created an unhealthy environment for residents. The letter explained that corrective actions would be taken. Immediately, the board members responsible for the most severe issues would be removed from their positions. Certain rules would be rewritten to make them clear and fair. All residents who received unfair fines or warnings would have them reviewed and, in most cases, removed entirely. Required training would also be given to the remaining HOA members, ensuring they understood their responsibilities and limitations. The neighborhood had never seen such a letter before. People stepped out of their homes holding the papers, their expressions stunned. Some cried out of relief. Others shook their heads, amazed that the situation they once thought impossible to change had finally shifted. As he stood on his porch, reading the letter over and over, he felt something he hadn't felt since he moved their dash piece. Later that afternoon, neighbors gathered outside, talking excitedly. For the first time in a long while, people weren't whispering. They were speaking openly, smiling, even laughing. Children played outside, without parents worrying about someone reporting them for noise. One neighbor approached him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She thanked him softly, saying none of this would have happened without his courage. Others joined in, expressing their gratitude. Even those who hadn't signed the complaint came forward to show appreciation. He felt humbled. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because it was the right thing. A few days later, a temporary committee was formed to help stabilize the HOA until new elections could be held. The review board chose a few residents who were known for being fair and respectful. They also invited him to be part of the temporary committee. He thought carefully before giving an answer. Being part of the committee would mean more work, more responsibility, more time spent dealing with the dent the old HOA had left behind. But he also realized something important. If he didn't step up now, things could fall back into old patterns, so he agreed. The first committee meeting was held in the community hall. The room felt lighter than it ever had. People came in with open minds and hopeful expressions. Instead of rigid rules, they talked about community needs. Instead of threats, they discussed improvements. They talked about making the neighborhood more welcoming. Ideas flowed in creating a small park area, hosting seasonal events, offering support to elderly residents who struggled with yard work, setting up clear guidelines that everyone could understand. The atmosphere felt like a fresh start. Over the next few months, everything began to change. Houses that once looked closed off now had open curtains and colorful decorations. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another now waved when passing by. People helped each other with small tasks, fixing a fence here, sharing tools there. The fear that had once controlled the neighborhood slowly dissolved. The rewritten rules were presented to everyone in a friendly meeting. Each rule was explained clearly, and residents had the chance to ask questions or suggest changes. People were amazed. This was the first time they felt included in decisions. A few of the old HOA members were allowed to stay in lower roles, but only after completing mandatory training. Surprisingly, some of them changed for the better, behaving more respectfully now that they understood their limits. New elections were held, and the community chose leaders who genuinely cared about the residents. The atmosphere during the voting process was warm and respectful. People felt hopeful about the future. As for him, he didn't run for a permanent position. He believed he had done his part and wanted others to experience the chance to lead, but he remained available whenever the community needed help. One evening, months after the investigation ended, he sat on his porch as the sunset painted the sky a soft orange. The street was quiet, but not the tense quiet it once was. It was peaceful. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. A neighbor walked by and waved. Someone across the street played music softly. He thought about everything that had happened, the warnings, the fear, the small meetings in his living room, the long hours organizing documents, the investigation, and finally the change. It had been a long journey, but it was worth it. The neighborhood was now a place where people felt safe and connected. A place where families could live without worrying about constant harassment. A place where rules protected the community instead of controlling it. A place where people could breathe. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the cool breeze brush past him. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who simply refused to give up, even when it seemed impossible. And because he stood up, others did too, and together, they changed everything. As the last bit of sunlight faded and the first stars appeared overhead, he felt grateful not just for the victory, but for the strength people found when they stood together. The HOA had pushed too far, but the outcome was something they never expected. A stronger, kinder, united community. And it all began with one person choosing not to stay silent.